The mahogany conference table in Catherine Morrison's law office still bore the faint scent of her favorite lavender perfume, even 3 weeks after her funeral, as if the woman who had saved me from a life of abandonment was somehow still present to witness the vultures circling her estate. I sat in the leather chair where she had taught me to review contracts and understand property law, staring at documents that proved I now owned 50 luxury properties across 3 countries, hotels, apartment complexes, commercial buildings worth over $30 million. The receptionist's voice crackled through the intercom, with news that would forever change my understanding of family and justice. Ms. Morrison, there are 2 people here claiming to be your biological parents. They have a lawyer with them and say they need to discuss your inheritance situation urgently. My biological parents. The words hit me like ice water, conjuring images of the man and woman who had surrendered me to São Paulo's overcrowded orphanage when I was barely 6 months old, then vanished from my life as completely as if they had never existed. For 25 years, Robert and Elena Vasquez had been nothing more than names on documents, ghosts who had chosen drugs and freedom over the responsibility of raising the daughter they had created. "Send them in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, though every instinct screamed at me to run from this confrontation that Catherine would never be here to help me navigate. They entered with the kind of calculated confidence that comes from hiring expensive legal representation, Robert wearing a suit that looked new and uncomfortable, Elena in a black dress that was probably meant to suggest mourning, but felt more like a costume. Behind them strode a sharp-faced attorney, whose briefcase and demeanor suggested this was not a social call about rekindling family relationships. "Madeline, mi amor," Elena began, her voice carrying traces of the accent I recognized from my own childhood, before Catherine had refined my speech with private tutoring. "You look so beautiful, so successful. We are so proud of the woman you have become." The presumption of pride from strangers who had contributed nothing to my development was breathtaking, but I remained silent as Robert stepped forward with the kind of awkward affection that might have been touching if it weren't so transparently calculated. "Hija, we know this must be confusing for you," he said, his eyes darting around the office that represented wealth beyond anything he had probably imagined when he signed away his parental rights. "We have always loved you, always thought about you, but circumstances, life made it impossible for us to be the parents you deserved." "Circumstances," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air while I studied their faces for any trace of genuine emotion beneath the obvious performance. "Is that what we're calling drug addiction and child abandonment now?" The lawyer stepped forward with professional smoothness, apparently recognizing that emotional appeals weren't resonating with their target audience. "Ms. Vasquez, I'm David Santos from Santos & Associates. My clients are here because they're concerned about your ability to manage such a substantial inheritance at your young age, and they want to discuss their legal rights as your biological parents." The name correction was deliberate. He had called me Ms. Vasquez instead of Ms. Morrison, attempting to erase 24 years of adoption and identity in favor of biological connections that had never been honored through presence or care. "My name is Madeline Morrison," I said firmly. "I was legally adopted by Catherine Morrison when I was 18 months old. My biological connection to these people ended the day they signed surrender documents at the orphanage." Elena's composure cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like desperation beneath her attempt at maternal concern. "Madeline, mi niña, you must understand that we were very young, very scared. We made mistakes, yes, but we never stopped loving you. Now that you have inherited so much wealth, we want to be part of your life again, to help you make good decisions, to be the family we should have been." "Where exactly were you planning to be this family?" I asked, genuinely curious about their version of events. "Catherine Morrison died 3 weeks ago after battling cancer for 8 months. She was in hospice care for the final 2 months. Where were you when your daughter needed family support during the most difficult period of her life?" The question apparently hadn't occurred to them, based on the glances they exchanged before Robert attempted an answer. We didn't know about Catherine's illness. We had lost contact over the years, but we always hoped." "You always hoped what? That someday you could return to claim benefits from the child you abandoned?" I stood up, moving to the window that looked out over the city where Catherine had built her empire while raising the daughter she chose to love. "Let me be very clear about something. Catherine Morrison was my mother in every way that matters. She was there for every scraped knee, every bad dream, every school play, every birthday, every moment of joy and sorrow for 24 years. You are strangers who share some DNA with me." The lawyer sensed that emotional manipulation wasn't working and shifted to legal threats. "Ms. Vasquez, regardless of your personal feelings, Brazilian family law provides biological parents with certain rights regarding their children's inheritances, especially when those inheritances are substantial enough to impact family welfare. My clients are prepared to file legal challenges to ensure their parental rights are protected. I smiled for the first time since they had entered the office, reaching for the sealed envelope that Catherine had left with specific instructions, to be opened only if Robert and Elena Vasquez attempt to claim parental rights or inheritance benefits. "Before you file any legal challenges," I said, breaking the wax seal that bore Catherine's family crest, "there's something you should probably know about your parental rights and family welfare obligations. The documents inside the envelope would change their lives forever, just as their abandonment had once changed mine." Catherine Morrison had been 38 years old, recently divorced, and running a small property management company when she first visited the São Paulo orphanage where I had been living for over a year, not searching for a child to adopt but delivering Christmas gifts as part of her company's annual charity drive. She would later tell me that she had planned to make a polite donation, take some photos for the company newsletter, and return to her comfortable life without children, or the complications they bring to carefully ordered existences. "You were sitting in the corner of the playroom, completely absorbed in trying to fit wooden blocks into a shape-sorting toy," Catherine had described during one of our many bedtime conversations when I was young and hungry for stories about how we found each other. "All the other children were running around, making noise, competing for attention from the visitors, but you were so focused, so determined to solve that puzzle, completely unaware that anyone was watching you." The image she painted was of an 18-month-old child who had already learned that attention from adults was unpredictable and often disappointing, so independence and self-sufficiency were better survival strategies than hoping for care that might not come. Even as a toddler, I had apparently understood that the only person I could truly depend on was myself. "I sat down beside you and started helping with the blocks," Catherine would continue, her voice warm with the memory of our first meeting. "You looked at me with these enormous brown eyes, so serious and careful, as if you were trying to decide whether I was trustworthy enough to accept help from. When you finally handed me a block and pointed to where it should go, I knew I was lost. The decision to adopt me hadn't been impulsive or driven by maternal instinct that suddenly awakened in the presence of adorable children. Catherine had spent weeks visiting the orphanage, bringing toys, and spending time with me while she researched the adoption process and honestly evaluated whether she was prepared for the life-changing commitment of single motherhood. I had to be sure, she had explained when I was old enough to understand the complexities of adoption decisions. Taking a child from the only home they know is an enormous responsibility. I needed to know that I could love you not just in theory, but in the reality of sleepless nights and temper tantrums, and all the difficult moments that come with raising a human being. The adoption process had taken 6 months of interviews, home studies, legal proceedings, and bureaucratic obstacles that tested Catherine's determination to make me her daughter. But she had navigated every requirement with the same methodical patience she brought to building her business empire, viewing each obstacle as a challenge to overcome, rather than a reason to reconsider her decision. "The day I brought you home, you cried for 3 hours straight," Catherine had told me with the fond exasperation of someone remembering difficult but precious times. "I think you were overwhelmed by having your own room, your own toys, your own person who was completely focused on your needs. You had never experienced that kind of attention before." The transition from institutional care to family life had required months of patience, as I learned that Catherine's love was reliable and unconditional, rather than dependent on good behavior or competition with other children. She had hired child psychologists who specialized in adoption trauma, ensuring that my early experiences of abandonment wouldn't define my ability to form healthy relationships. "You were such a serious little girl," Catherine would say, when friends commented on my mature behavior and advanced vocabulary. "You watched everything, remembered everything, learned everything. It was like you were determined to become the kind of person who would never be abandoned again." The determination had served me well academically and professionally, but Catherine had worked hard to ensure that my drive for achievement was balanced with understanding that her love wasn't conditional on my performance. She celebrated my successes without making them the source of my worth, and she supported me through failures without making them evidence of inadequacy. "Success is wonderful, minha filha, but it's not why I love you," she would say, when I brought home perfect report cards or won academic competitions. "I love you because you're kind to people who can't help you, because you work hard even when no one is watching, because you have integrity that can't be purchased or borrowed. Those are the qualities that matter in life." Catherine's business had grown exponentially during my childhood, transforming from a small property management firm into a luxury real estate empire that owned prime properties in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Miami. But success had never changed her priorities or reduced the time she invested in being present for the daughter she had chosen to raise. Money is a tool, not a destination, she would explain, while teaching me to read financial statements and understand investment strategies. The purpose of wealth is creating security and opportunities, not collecting possessions or impressing people who don't matter. Everything I build is really for you, to ensure that you'll always have choices and never be dependent on people who might let you down. The empire she had built was her final gift of love, security that would last a lifetime, along with the knowledge and skills to manage it responsibly. The official documents in my adoption file told a story of bureaucratic efficiency. Female infant, approximately 6 months of age, surrendered to estado do bem-estar social by biological parents citing inability to provide adequate care due to financial and personal circumstances. But the reality behind those clinical words was a tragedy of addiction, poverty, and parents who chose their next fix over their daughter's future. Robert and Elena Vasquez had been 22 and 19 years old, respectively, when I was born, already deep in the cycle of drug dependency that would define their priorities for the next 2 decades. According to the social worker's reports that Catherine had obtained during the adoption process, I had been found in an apartment that was condemned for health violations, severely malnourished, and showing signs of neglect that suggested my basic needs had been ignored for extended periods. The child appears to have been caring for herself to the extent possible for an infant, the intake report noted with clinical detachment. She shows unusual alertness and self-soothing behaviors that indicate adaptation to inconsistent caregiving. Medical examination reveals malnutrition, but no evidence of physical abuse. Parents report being overwhelmed by childcare responsibilities. Overwhelmed. The euphemism disguised the reality that Robert and Elena had been more committed to their drug habits than to the helpless infant who depended on them for survival. The apartment where I had spent my first 6 months was described in court documents as uninhabitable, with no food in the refrigerator, no clean clothes or diapers, and evidence of drug use throughout the living space. Your biological parents signed surrender documents the day after you were brought to the orphanage, Catherine had explained when I was old enough to understand the legal aspects of my adoption. They said they wanted you to have opportunities they couldn't provide, but the social worker noted that they seemed more relieved than grief-stricken about giving up parental responsibilities. The orphanage where I had spent the next year of my life was better than the apartment where I was born, but only marginally. São Paulo's public children's services were overwhelmed and underfunded, providing basic shelter and nutrition, but little individual attention or emotional support for the dozens of abandoned children in their care. You learned to walk in that orphanage, Catherine had told me, her voice carrying sadness for the milestones I had reached without anyone celebrating them. The caregivers were kind people, but there were too many children, and not enough hands. You figured out how to climb out of your crib, how to get food when you were hungry, how to comfort yourself when you were scared. You were incredibly independent for such a young child. The independence had been survival rather than choice, the adaptation of an infant who learned early that crying didn't bring comfort, and needs weren't automatically met by caring adults. By the time Catherine found me, I had already developed the self-reliance that would characterize my personality throughout childhood and into adulthood. When I started visiting you at the orphanage, you were so careful about trusting me, Catherine had said, describing the weeks of patient relationship building that preceded my adoption. You would play with me, but you always kept one eye on the door, as if you expected me to disappear like other adults had. It broke my heart to realize that you had already learned that people leave. The legal process of finalizing my adoption had required termination of Robert and Elena's parental rights, a court proceeding that they had failed to attend, despite being formally notified of the date and time. The judge had granted the termination based on their abandonment and failure to make any effort to reclaim custody or support their daughter during the year I had been in state care. The biological parents have shown no interest in maintaining contact with the child or contributing to her welfare, the court record stated. Their rights are hereby terminated, and the child is free for adoption by any qualified family willing to provide permanent placement. Catherine had been more than qualified, having completed all required screenings, home studies, and preparation classes, while demonstrating both emotional readiness and financial capability to provide for my needs. The final adoption decree had been signed on my 2nd birthday, officially making me Madeline Morrison, and legally erasing any connection to the Vasquez family name. That was the happiest day of my life, Catherine had told me every year on my adoption day, which we celebrated as enthusiastically as my biological birthday. The day you became my daughter forever. The day I became your mother forever. the day we became a real family. The celebration had always included looking through photo albums that documented my transformation from the serious, wary toddler in the orphanage pictures to the confident, loved child who had grown up secure in Catherine's devotion. The contrast was visible in every image. Before adoption, I looked like a child who was protecting herself from disappointment. After adoption, I looked like a child who had never doubted that she was cherished. "You bloomed like a flower in sunlight," Catherine would say, while reviewing the photos that showed my gradual relaxation into childhood joy. "It took months for you to believe that I wasn't going anywhere, that you didn't have to earn my love or worry about losing it." Now, sitting across from the biological parents who had created the trauma Catherine spent years healing, I wondered if they had any comprehension of what their abandonment had cost their daughter, and what their return was about to cost them. Catherine's property empire had been constructed with the methodical patience of someone building a legacy for the daughter she adored, each acquisition carefully researched and strategically planned to create lasting wealth that would provide security for generations. She had started with a single apartment building in São Paulo's Vila Madalena neighborhood, purchased with her divorce settlement and transformed from a run-down rental property into luxury condominiums that attracted young professionals and international buyers. "Every property I buy is really for you," Catherine had told me when I was 8 years old and accompanying her to inspect a potential hotel acquisition in Rio de Janeiro. "Someday you'll own all of this, and I want to make sure that every building, every investment, every business decision will serve you well when I'm no longer here to guide you." The morbid practicality of planning for her death had unsettled me as a child, but Catherine had insisted that responsible parents prepare their children for independence rather than dependence. She had included me in every major business decision, teaching me to analyze market conditions, evaluate renovation costs, and understand the difference between properties that generated income and properties that merely looked impressive. "Beautiful buildings that lose money are expensive hobbies, not investments," she would explain, while reviewing financial projections for potential purchases. "We buy properties that will be profitable for decades, that will provide reliable income whether the economy is strong or struggling, that will increase in value over time rather than requiring constant financial support." The strategy had been consistently successful, creating a portfolio of luxury hotels, upscale apartment complexes, and prime commercial properties that generated substantial monthly income while appreciating in value year after year. By the time Catherine died, her empire included properties in São Paulo's most exclusive neighborhoods, beachfront hotels in Rio de Janeiro, and luxury condominiums in Miami that served wealthy Brazilians seeking international real estate investments. "Your mother was a visionary," said Dr. Ricardo Ferreira, the property law attorney who had worked with Catherine for 15 years and helped structure her acquisitions to maximize tax advantages and inheritance benefits. She understood that luxury real estate in prime locations would always have demand from people with money, regardless of economic fluctuations or political changes. But Catherine's business success had never overshadowed her commitment to being present in my daily life, attending every school event, helping with homework, and ensuring that her wealth didn't shield me from understanding the value of hard work and personal responsibility. "Money without character is dangerous," she would say, when friends suggested that my inheritance might make me lazy or entitled. "Madeline needs to understand that wealth is responsibility, not privilege. She needs to earn her own achievements and develop her own capabilities so that she can manage what I'm leaving her with wisdom rather than just enjoying it with ignorance." The lessons had been comprehensive and practical, covering everything from reading financial statements to negotiating with contractors to understanding tenant relationships that generated the rental income supporting our lifestyle. Catherine had insisted that I work summer jobs during high school and university, despite having no financial need for employment, because she wanted me to understand the perspective of people who depended on wages rather than investment returns. "Your employees and tenants are partners in your success," she had explained after I complained about demanding customers during my summer job at a luxury hotel. "Their rent payments and room bookings generate the profits that maintain your security. You must always remember that your wealth depends on their satisfaction with the services you provide." The philosophy had shaped Catherine's approach to property management, investing heavily in maintenance, amenities, and customer service that justified premium pricing while creating long-term tenant loyalty. Her buildings had waiting lists because she provided quality that exceeded expectations, establishing reputation and demand that made her properties more valuable than comparable competitors. "Senora Morrison treats us like family, not just tenants," explained Maria Santos, who who had rented an apartment in one of Catherine's buildings for 12 years. When my husband lost his job, she worked with us on payment plans. When our baby was born, she sent gifts. When we needed repairs, she fixed them immediately. That's why we would never move somewhere else, even if we found cheaper rent. The tenant loyalty Catherine had cultivated translated into consistent occupancy rates and rental income that provided financial stability even during economic downturns when other property owners struggled with vacancies and reduced revenues. Her reputation for fairness and quality had created a business model that benefited everyone involved while generating substantial profits. She understood that treating people well is not just moral behavior, it's good business, Dr. Ferreira observed when reviewing Catherine's financial records after her death. Her properties consistently outperformed market averages because she invested in relationships rather than just collecting rent. The empire I had inherited wasn't just valuable real estate. It was a network of businesses and relationships that Catherine had spent 20 years building with integrity and vision. Each property came with its own history of careful management and community trust that would serve me well as the new owner. But more importantly, each building represented Catherine's love made tangible, her determination to provide security for the daughter who had once been abandoned and who would never be vulnerable to anyone's neglect again. The first document in Catherine's sealed envelope was a court order dated 24 years earlier, signed by Judge Maria Helena Santos of São Paulo's family court, that terminated Robert and Elena Vasquez's parental rights, not just through standard abandonment proceedings, but through a more severe legal finding that carried financial consequences they had apparently never understood. Order for termination of parental rights with delinquent child support assessment. The heading read in official Portuguese legal language that left no room for ambiguous interpretation. The court finds that Robert Antonio Vasquez and Elena Maria Santos have willfully abandoned their minor daughter and failed to provide legally mandated financial support, resulting in accumulated debt to the state welfare system in the amount of $47,000 as of this date. Dr. Santos, the lawyer representing my biological parents, read over my shoulder with growing alarm as he apparently realized that his clients had failed to disclose crucial information about their legal history when hiring him to pursue inheritance claims. "This can't be right," Elena said, her voice rising with panic as she tried to process legal language that was reshaping her understanding of her position. "We signed surrender papers. We gave up rights, yes, but that meant we were free from obligations too. No one ever said anything about owing money. Surrender of parental rights doesn't eliminate child support obligations that accumulated before surrender," I explained, having learned enough property law from Catherine to understand the basics of family legal responsibility. "When you abandoned me, the state had to pay for my care, medical expenses, and housing at the orphanage. Under Brazilian law, biological parents remain financially responsible for those costs even after terminating their rights." Robert was frantically reading through the court documents, his face growing paler as he found additional pages detailing interest calculations, penalty assessments, and legal fees that had been accumulating for 24 years, while he and Elena lived in blissful ignorance of their growing debt to the judicial system. "The accumulated balance as of today's date is $2,247,000, read Dr. Patricia Silva, Catherine's attorney who had apparently been expecting this moment. "That includes the original child support debt, compound interest at legal rates, administrative fees, and court costs associated with the abandonment proceedings. 2,247,000 rees. The number hung in the air like a death sentence, representing more money than Robert and Elena had probably earned in their entire adult lives combined, certainly more than they could ever hope to repay, given their apparent financial circumstances and employment history. "That's impossible," Robert stammered. His earlier confidence completely evaporated as he faced the mathematical reality of 24 years of compound interest on unpaid legal obligations. "We don't have that kind of money. We could never pay that kind of money. There has to be some kind of statute of limitations or forgiveness program." Dr. Silva's smile was professionally polite, but completely unsympathetic. Child support debts don't disappear due to statute of limitations in Brazil, and there are no forgiveness programs for parents who abandon their children to state care. The debt accumulates until paid in full, or until the debtor's death. The second document in Catherine's envelope was even more devastating. A formal request to the court system asking that collection proceedings begin immediately against Robert and Elena Vasquez for their delinquent child support obligations, filed 3 weeks earlier on the day after Catherine's funeral. "Catherine initiated debt collection?" I asked, surprised that my adoptive mother had taken such aggressive legal action without mentioning her plans to me. "She filed the paperwork months ago but asked that it be held until after her death," Dr. Silva explained. Catherine didn't want you to have to deal with this situation while she was alive, but she also didn't want Robert and Elena to benefit from her passing by making inheritance claims on wealth that was built while they ignored their legal obligations to support you. The third document was the most comprehensive. A complete financial investigation of Robert and Elena's assets, employment history, and lifestyle over the past 24 years, compiled by private investigators who had been tracking their activities since they first made contact with Catherine's law office 6 months earlier. Your biological parents have been living in Argentina for the past 15 years, Dr. Silva reported while reviewing the investigation results. Robert works sporadically in construction. Elena cleans houses for wealthy families. Their combined annual income rarely exceeds $30,000, and they have no significant assets, property, or savings. The investigation had been thorough and professionally conducted, revealing that Robert and Elena had indeed overcome their drug addictions sometime in their 30s, but had never achieved financial stability or career success that would enable them to repay their accumulated child support debt. They were contacted by an inheritance research firm 6 months ago, Dr. Silva continued, reading from the investigator's report. Someone who specializes in locating heirs for wealthy estates. When they learned about Catherine's terminal diagnosis and your potential inheritance, they began planning their return to Brazil to pursue what they believed would be parental rights to your assets. The timing was devastatingly calculated. Robert and Elena hadn't returned to Brazil out of genuine concern for my well-being during Catherine's illness, but because professional heir hunters had informed them that their abandoned daughter was about to inherit millions of dollars. So they owe 2 million reais, Dr. Santos said weakly, apparently trying to find some legal strategy that might protect his clients from complete financial destruction. But they also have inheritance rights as biological parents that might offset the debt. I smiled at the lawyer who was about to receive the worst news of his legal career. Actually, I said, opening the final document in Catherine's envelope, they don't have inheritance rights at all. The private investigator's report painted a detailed portrait of Robert and Elena's lives during the quarter century they had been absent from mine, documenting choices that revealed character patterns extending far beyond their initial abandonment of parental responsibilities. The file was thick with photographs, employment records, legal documents, and witness interviews that showed two people who had consistently chosen their own comfort and convenience over difficult obligations or delayed gratification. After surrendering custody of their daughter, the subjects relocated to Argentina within 6 months, read the investigator's summary, which Catherine had commissioned after receiving the first contact from Robert and Elena through their lawyer. Immigration records show multiple border crossings over subsequent years, suggesting they used international relocation to avoid Brazilian legal obligations and potential debt collection efforts. The pattern had been established immediately after my adoption. Robert and Elena had fled to Buenos Aires, not to start fresh lives as reformed individuals seeking redemption, but to escape a legal system that might eventually hold them accountable for abandoning their child. Their recovery from drug addiction, while genuine, had been motivated more by survival necessity than moral awakening. Subject Robert Vasquez worked various construction jobs throughout Argentina, primarily in Buenos Aires and Mendoza, the report continued. Employment history shows consistent pattern of leaving positions before completion of contracted work, or when supervisors attempted to address performance issues. No evidence of career advancement or skill development over a 20-year period. Elena's work history was similarly disappointing, showing sporadic employment in domestic service, restaurant work, and seasonal agricultural labor, with frequent gaps that suggested periods of unemployment or unreported income. Neither had developed professional skills, built savings, or demonstrated the kind of personal growth that might justify their long absence from my life. Subjects maintained no contact with family members in Brazil for a 15-year period, the investigator noted. When contacted by heir research firm 6 months ago, they expressed surprise that their daughter had been adopted by a wealthy family and claimed to have believed she remained in state care. The claim of ignorance was particularly offensive because it suggested that Robert and Elena had abandoned me so completely that they hadn't even bothered to discover what happened to their daughter after surrender. They had been content to assume I was growing up in institutional care while they built new lives in another country. Financial records show subjects lived consistently paycheck to paycheck, despite low housing costs and minimal family obligations, the report continued. Bank accounts rarely maintained balances exceeding $500 equivalent. No evidence of savings, investments, or financial planning. Spending patterns suggest prioritization of immediate gratification over long-term security. The financial analysis was damning because it revealed that Robert and Elena's poverty wasn't due to systemic barriers or unavoidable circumstances, but to lifestyle choices that prioritize leisure spending over building stability or paying legal obligations. They had chosen to remain poor by spending everything they earned, rather than developing financial discipline. Subjects maintained relationship with other Brazilian expatriates in Buenos Aires, but avoided any individuals who might have knowledge of their Brazilian legal situation, the investigator observed. Social circle consisted primarily of other economic migrants seeking to escape financial or legal problems in Brazil. The social analysis suggested that Robert and Elena had surrounded themselves with people who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about their past or challenge their narrative of being victims of circumstances beyond their control. They had built a community of mutual self-deception, rather than accountability. In 2018, subject Elena gave birth to son Diego Vasquez, father unknown, the report noted with clinical detachment. Child currently ages 7 and attending public school in Buenos Aires. Subjects provide adequate basic care, but no evidence of educational investment or enrichment activities. The revelation that I had a half-brother was shocking and complicated my emotional response to Robert and Elena's return. They had managed to raise another child during the years they claimed to be thinking about the daughter they had abandoned, apparently demonstrating parental capabilities they had been unwilling or unable to provide for me. Subjects first learned of Catherine Morrison's terminal illness through air research firm Santos and Associates in São Paulo, which specializes in locating potential beneficiaries of large estates, the report concluded. Initial contact was made 6 months ago, when Morrison's condition was publicly disclosed through business publications covering her real estate empire. The timeline was devastatingly clear. Robert and Elena had remained completely uninterested in my welfare until professional heir hunters informed them that their abandoned daughter was about to inherit substantial wealth. Their sudden parental concern had been triggered by financial opportunity rather than emotional awakening. Throughout 25-year period, subjects made no attempts to contact daughter, contribute to support, or verify welfare, the investigator's final assessment read. No evidence of remorse, rehabilitation, or genuine parental feeling. Current contact appears motivated entirely by inheritance expectations, rather than family reconciliation. The report included photographs of Robert and Elena's current living situation in Buenos Aires, a modest apartment, used furniture, and lifestyle markers consistent with working-class income, rather than the poverty they claimed made it impossible to pay child support obligations. They had spent 25 years living free from the consequences of abandoning their daughter, only to discover that freedom had been an illusion, and the bill had been accumulating with interest. The São Paulo Civil Court's debt collection proceedings began with the mechanical efficiency of a legal system that had been waiting 24 years to hold Robert and Elena accountable for abandoning their parental responsibilities, and the first official notice was delivered to their Buenos Aires address with international courier service that required personal signature and photographic identification. Formal demand for payment, outstanding child support obligations, read the document that would destroy whatever financial stability Robert and Elena had managed to build during their decades of avoidance. Total amount due, $2,147,000. Payment required within 30 days to avoid asset seizure and international debt collection enforcement. Dr. Silva had explained the collection process with the satisfaction of someone who had been preparing for this moment since Catherine first asked her to investigate Robert and Elena's legal vulnerabilities. Brazilian family courts have reciprocal agreements with Argentina for enforcement of child support obligations. Robert and Elena cannot escape this debt by remaining outside Brazil. The 30-day payment demand was followed immediately by asset investigation orders that froze their Buenos Aires bank accounts, placed liens on any property they might own, and garnished Elena's wages from the wealthy family where she worked as a housekeeper. The legal mechanisms moved with devastating precision, dismantling their financial life within days of learning about their existence. They're claiming they can't afford lawyers to fight the debt collection, Dr. Santos reported during a desperate phone call from Buenos Aires, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who had realized his clients had been less than honest about their legal history. They want to know if there are any settlement options or payment plan alternatives that might reduce the accumulated amount. Child support debt cannot be reduced through settlement negotiations, Dr. Silva responded with professional coldness. The amount owed is calculated according to legal formulas that account for inflation, interest, and administrative costs. The only way to reduce the debt is to pay it. The response prompted increasingly frantic communications from Robert and Elena, who apparently had not anticipated that their daughter's inheritance would come with legal mechanisms to collect decades of unpaid obligations. Their initial strategy of claiming parental rights had backfired spectacularly, triggering debt collection procedures they had successfully avoided through international relocation. "They're asking about bankruptcy protection," Dr. Santos reported during his next call, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer would be unsatisfactory. "Can child support debt be discharged through bankruptcy proceedings in Brazil?" "Child support obligations survive bankruptcy," Dr. Silva confirmed. "They cannot be discharged, settled, or eliminated through any legal procedure. The debt will follow them until death or full payment, whichever comes first." The investigation had also revealed that Robert and Elena's current financial situation was even more precarious than initially reported. Elena's employer, upon learning about the international debt collection proceedings, had terminated her employment to avoid complications with wage garnishment. Robert's construction work was irregular and paid in cash, making it difficult for creditors to locate, but also impossible to build legitimate financial records. Their combined monthly income is approximately $800 USD equivalent, the court investigator reported. After basic living expenses for 3 people, including 7-year-old son Diego, they have negative monthly cash flow. Full debt repayment at current income levels would require approximately 250 years. The mathematical impossibility of repayment had prompted Robert and Elena to explore increasingly desperate alternatives to their legal obligations. They had contacted multiple law firms seeking representation for appeals that had no basis in law, investigated immigration opportunities to countries without reciprocal debt collection agreements with Brazil, and even consulted with bankruptcy attorneys who confirmed that child support debt was inescapable. "They're proposing to sign over any future inheritance rights in exchange for debt forgiveness," Dr. Santos offered, during what would be his final communication on behalf of clients who could no longer afford his services. "Complete renunciation of any claims to their daughter's assets, in perpetuity, if the court will eliminate the accumulated support obligations. Their inheritance rights were terminated 24 years ago when the court found them unfit parents," Dr. E. Silva replied with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a slow student. "They have no future inheritance rights to renounce. The debt collection proceeds regardless of their relationship to Madeline Morrison." The final option was the most desperate. Robert and Elena had contacted international heir research firms to investigate whether they might have claims to other family estates that could be used to pay their child support obligations. They were essentially searching for other wealthy relatives they could exploit to escape consequences for abandoning me. "The investigation shows they have no living relatives with substantial assets," Dr. Silva reported after reviewing their family genealogy research. "Their parents died in poverty, their siblings work in low-wage occupations, and they have no connections to inherited wealth of any kind. The debt collection system had trapped them in Buenos Aires without resources to relocate, without income sufficient for living expenses, and without legal alternatives to obligations that would consume any future earnings for the rest of their lives. They made one final settlement offer," Dr. Silva said, reading from the last communication received from their Argentine legal counsel. "They proposed to surrender custody of their 7-year-old son Diego to Brazilian authorities in exchange for debt reduction, claiming that providing their daughter with a brother would offset their historical obligations to her. The suggestion was so morally bankrupt that even Dr. Silva, who had seen decades of family legal disputes, seemed shocked by their willingness to abandon a second child to escape financial consequences for abandoning the first. 25 years later, the bill had finally arrived with interest. With their Argentine assets frozen and wages garnished, Robert and Elena's desperation manifested in increasingly bizarre attempts to manipulate both the legal system and my emotions, beginning with a series of handwritten letters that alternated between threats, pleading, and accusations that revealed the depth of their narcissistic inability to accept responsibility for consequences they had spent decades avoiding. "Madeline, you are destroying your own parents over money that you don't even need," Elena wrote in a letter that arrived with Buenos Aires postmarks, but no return address, suggesting they were having mail forwarded to avoid debt collection officers. "You have 50 properties and millions of dollars, while we are living like refugees in a foreign country because of debts we never knew existed. This is not justice. This is revenge by a daughter who has forgotten where she came from." The accusation that I was pursuing revenge rather than justice revealed Elena's fundamental misunderstanding of both legal obligations and moral responsibility. The child support debt hadn't been created by my desire to punish them. It had been accumulating automatically for 24 years while they enjoyed freedom from the financial burden of supporting the daughter they had abandoned to state care. We are prepared to go to international media outlets to expose how wealthy Brazilian families use legal technicalities to destroy poor immigrants who cannot defend themselves," Robert wrote in his own letter, apparently believing that public sympathy for their situation would pressure me to forgive debts they owed to the government rather than to me personally. The threat of media exposure was particularly ironic, given that their story would likely generate sympathy for the child they had abandoned, rather than the parents who had fled to another country to escape responsibility for their actions. But Robert and Elena seemed to believe that portraying themselves as victims of legal persecution would somehow transform their moral position from debt evaders to persecution survivors. Dr. Silva had anticipated these manipulation attempts and prepared legal responses that protected both my privacy and the integrity of the debt collection process. Any media contact will be referred to the court system's Public Information Office, which will provide official documentation of the abandonment proceedings and accumulated child support obligations. The facts speak for themselves. The most disturbing development was Robert and Elena's attempt to involve their 7-year-old son Diego in their campaign for debt forgiveness, coaching him to write letters asking me to help my parents, and including photographs designed to evoke sympathy for a child who was now experiencing the consequences of his parents' financial irresponsibility. "Dear Sister Madeline," the child's letter began in Portuguese that was clearly dictated by adults. "My mama and papa are very sad because they cannot buy food for me. They say you are very rich and you can help us if you want to. I am a good boy, and I will be your friend if you make the sadness go away." The exploitation of Diego's innocence was perhaps the most revealing demonstration of Robert and Elena's character. They were willing to traumatize their own child with fears of poverty and abandonment, rather than accept accountability for debts they had legitimately incurred through parental neglect. Using a child to manipulate debt collection proceedings is considered a form of harassment under Brazilian law, Dr. Silva explained when I asked about legal remedies for protecting Diego from his parents' desperate schemes. "We can request court orders prohibiting any further contact that involves minor children, but enforcement across international borders is complicated." The harassment escalated when Robert and Elena began contacting property managers and tenants in Catherine's real estate portfolio, attempting to convince them that my inheritance was illegitimate and that the buildings they lived in would soon be seized by courts to pay their debts. The misinformation campaign was designed to create management problems that might pressure me into settlement negotiations. "Several tenants have called asking about the stability of their housing situation," reported Dr. Ferreira, who managed the day-to-day operations of Catherine's property empire. "They received phone calls from people claiming to be your biological parents, saying that court proceedings would result in property seizures and eviction notices." The tenant harassment backfired when Dr. Silva obtained court orders prohibiting any contact between Robert, Elena, and anyone connected to my business interests, backed by penalties that could result in criminal charges for violation of debt collection regulations. But the most desperate measure was their attempt to hire private investigators to search for evidence that Catherine had obtained my adoption through illegal means, or that I was somehow not legitimately entitled to inherit her estate. They had apparently convinced themselves that discrediting my legal status as Catherine's daughter would eliminate both my inheritance rights and their child support obligations. The investigators they hired quickly discovered that Catherine's adoption of you was completely legal and properly documented. Dr. Silva reported after being contacted by the Argentine firm that Robert and Elena had engaged with money they claimed not to have. When the investigators informed them that their theory had no basis in law, they refused to pay the investigation fees, creating additional debt problems in Argentina. Their final desperate measure was the most pathetic. Robert and Elena had begun contacting other wealthy Brazilian families, offering to sell inside information about inheritance law loopholes and debt collection strategies in exchange for money to pay their obligations. They were essentially trying to monetize their experience as deadbeat parents by advising other wealthy families on how to avoid legal accountability. No reputable legal counsel would purchase advice from people who have spent 24 years unsuccessfully evading their own legal obligations, Dr. Silva observed with professional disdain. They're offering to sell expertise they clearly don't possess to people who wouldn't trust their judgment about simple matters, let alone complex legal strategy. The desperate measures had only deepened their legal problems, while demonstrating that Robert and Elena remained fundamentally incapable of accepting responsibility for the consequences of their choices. The complete truth about Robert and Elena's abandonment of me came to light through documents that Catherine had been collecting for years, but had chosen not to share during her lifetime, wanting to protect me from understanding the full extent of my biological parents' callousness until I was mature enough to process the information without being destroyed by it. Catherine knew far more about your biological parents' history than she ever told you, Dr. Silva explained while opening a vault in her law office that contained files Catherine had been building since my adoption. She hired investigators periodically over the years to monitor their activities and ensure they weren't attempting to exploit their biological connection to you. The vault contained surveillance photos, court documents, employment records, and witness testimonies that painted a devastating portrait of Robert and Elena, not as people who had made youthful mistakes, but as individuals whose abandonment of me had been part of a consistent pattern of avoiding responsibility for their actions throughout their adult lives. Your biological parents had other children before you, Dr. Silva revealed, handing me birth certificates and abandonment records for 2 older siblings I had never known existed. A son born when Elena was 17, who was surrendered to state care within 3 months. A daughter born when Elena was 18, also surrendered within 6 months. You were their 3rd child, not their first experience with parental responsibilities. The revelation was devastating because it meant that Robert and Elena hadn't abandoned me due to inexperience or temporary circumstances, but because they had already established abandonment as their standard response to parenthood. I was just the 3rd child they had decided was too inconvenient to raise. What happened to my siblings? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The son died in state care at age 4, due to complications from malnutrition and neglect before his surrender, Dr. Silva said gently. The daughter was adopted by a family in Rio de Janeiro, and has no knowledge of her biological parents' identity or location. The information that I had a living sister somewhere in Brazil created a complex mix of emotions: hope that she had found loving adoptive parents like Catherine, and grief for the brother who had died because Robert and Elena had waited too long to surrender him to better care. Catherine tracked down your sister when you were 16, Dr. Silva continued, showing me recent photographs of a young woman who looked remarkably like me, but with different coloring. Her name is Sophia. She's a university student studying medicine, and her adoptive family knows nothing about her biological background. Catherine decided not to contact them because Sophia appeared happy and well-adjusted, and disrupting her life to tell her about siblings might have caused more harm than benefit. The photographs showed Sophia at university graduation, surrounded by adoptive parents and siblings who clearly adored her. She looked confident, successful, and loved, everything that Catherine had given me and that Robert and Elena had failed to provide any of their children. Catherine established a trust fund for Sophia without her knowledge, Dr. Silva explained, showing me financial documents that proved Catherine's generosity extended even to children she had never met. If she ever needs medical expenses, educational funding, or emergency assistance, the trust will provide support. But Catherine structured it so Sophia would never know the money came from her biological sister's adoptive mother. The secret trust fund was pure Catherine, providing help while protecting dignity, ensuring that Sophia would have resources without forcing her to confront painful truths about her biological origins, unless she chose to pursue them. But the vault contained even more damaging information about Robert and Elena's behavior during the years following my adoption. They had attempted to surrender their son Diego twice during his infancy, being prevented only by Argentine social services that required more extensive documentation and waiting periods than Brazilian authorities had demanded. They tried to abandon Diego when he was 4 months old, claiming they couldn't handle the financial burden of child support. Dr. Silva read from Argentine court documents that Catherine's investigators had obtained. When that surrender was rejected due to procedural issues, they tried again when he was 8 months old. Both attempts failed because Argentine law requires biological parents to demonstrate genuine efforts to provide care before terminating rights. The information meant that Diego was only still with Robert and Elena because Argentine bureaucracy was more stringent than Brazilian procedures had been 25 years earlier. They had been just as willing to abandon their 4th child as they had been to abandon their first 3. Catherine was planning to intervene in Diego's situation if Robert and Elena successfully abandoned him, Dr. Silva revealed. She had contacted Argentine lawyers about adopting him herself to spare another child from growing up in institutional care. The revelation that Catherine had been prepared to adopt Diego demonstrated the depth of her commitment to protecting children from Robert and Elena's parental failures, even after her own terminal diagnosis made long-term planning impractical. Why didn't Catherine tell me about any of this? I asked, overwhelmed by the scope of information that had been hidden from me for years. Because she wanted you to form your own judgments about Robert and Elena based on their current behavior, not their historical patterns, Dr. Silva explained. She believed that if you knew about their previous abandonments and their attempts to surrender Diego, You might feel obligated to forgive them out of pity, rather than holding them accountable for their choices. The vault's final revelation was the most shocking. Catherine had been secretly supporting Diego's care for 3 years, sending monthly payments to Robert and Elena that they believed came from Argentine social services, but which actually came from Catherine's determination to ensure that another child didn't suffer because of their financial irresponsibility. Catherine was paying approximately $300 per month to ensure Diego had adequate nutrition, clothing, and educational materials. Dr. Silva showed me bank records documenting years of anonymous support. She arranged it through intermediary accounts so Robert and Elena would never know the money came from their abandoned daughter's adoptive mother. Even from her deathbed, Catherine had been protecting the children that Robert and Elena had been willing to abandon. Now I understood why the child support debt collection had been so important to Catherine. It wasn't about revenge or punishment, but about ensuring that Robert and Elena finally faced consequences for a pattern of child abandonment that had destroyed multiple lives while they enjoyed freedom from responsibility. 6 months after Robert and Elena's desperate return to Brazil and subsequent legal destruction, I stood in Catherine's former office, now my office, reviewing architectural plans for the Catherine Morrison Children's Foundation, a residential facility that would provide loving care for abandoned children while their cases moved through Brazil's overwhelmed adoption system. The residential facility will house up to 50 children at any given time, explained Dr. Marina Costa, the child welfare expert I had hired to design programs that would prevent other children from experiencing the institutional neglect I had survived before Catherine found me. Each child will have private bedrooms, dedicated educational support, psychological counseling, and most importantly, consistent caregivers who can provide emotional stability during the legal processes that determine their permanent placements. The foundation represented Catherine's values made tangible through resources I now controlled, transforming her property empire into a legacy that would protect vulnerable children for generations. 5 of Catherine's luxury hotels had been converted into family-style residential facilities with professional staff trained to provide the kind of individualized attention that government orphanages couldn't offer due to funding limitations and overwhelming caseloads. We've received over 300 adoption applications since announcing the foundation, Dr. Costa reported with satisfaction. The improved living conditions and comprehensive support services are attracting adoptive families who want to ensure children are healthy and well-adjusted before placement. The success of the Foundation's approach was already visible in the first group of children who had been placed in permanent homes, healthy and confident placements that contrasted dramatically with the traumatized children typically available for adoption after years of institutional care. Robert and Elena's child support debt had continued accumulating during their months of legal maneuvering, reaching our $3 million by the time their final appeal was rejected by São Paulo's highest family court. The debt would follow them for the rest of their lives, garnishing any formal employment income and preventing them from ever building legitimate wealth in Brazil or any country with reciprocal collection agreements. They've stopped making any payments toward the debt, Dr. Silva reported during our monthly legal review. Their current strategy appears to be complete avoidance of any documented income or assets that could be subject to collection proceedings. The avoidance strategy had forced Robert and Elena deeper into poverty and social isolation, working only in cash employment that provided survival income, but prevented them from accessing banking services, obtaining credit, or building any financial security for themselves or Diego. But Diego's situation had been resolved through Catherine's final gift of foresight and planning. The anonymous monthly support she had been providing was converted into a full scholarship fund that would cover his education, health care, and living expenses through university graduation, administered through Argentine social services without any connection to his biological parents' legal problems. Diego has been accepted to a boarding school in Buenos Aires that serves academically gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds, Dr. Silva reported with obvious satisfaction. The scholarship covers full tuition, housing, meals, and educational materials. He'll receive the kind of educational opportunities that will allow him to build a successful life, regardless of his parents' financial situation. The scholarship was structured to protect Diego from his parents' influence, while providing him with resources to escape the cycle of poverty and poor decision-making that had characterized Robert and Elena's adult lives. By age 18, he would have educational credentials and life skills that would enable him to support himself and pursue whatever career path attracted his interests and abilities. Catherine's investigators had been monitoring Diego's academic performance for 2 years, Dr. Silva explained when I asked how Catherine had known about his educational potential. Despite his parents' limitations, Diego consistently scored in the top 10% of his class and showed particular aptitude for mathematics and languages. Catherine wanted to ensure that intellectual gifts wouldn't be wasted due to lack of opportunity. The protection of Diego represented everything Catherine had taught me about responsibility that accompanies wealth, using resources to create opportunities for people who couldn't create them for themselves, while ensuring that help was structured to promote independence rather than dependence. I had also established contact with Sofia, my biological sister in Rio de Janeiro, through Dr. Silva's careful intermediation that respected her privacy, while providing her with information about her biological background and available resources from Catherine's trust fund. Sofia was initially shocked to learn she had siblings, but she's expressed interest in meeting you, Dr. Silva reported after months of delicate negotiations with Sofia's adoptive family. Her adoptive parents are supportive of contact, as long as it doesn't disrupt the family relationships they've built over 23 years. The relationship with Sofia was developing slowly and carefully, based on mutual choice rather than biological obligation, allowing us to build genuine connection without the pressure of expectations we couldn't realistically meet after decades of separation. My biological parents had learned that abandoning children carries consequences that compound over time, just like the interest on debts that accumulate while debtors convince themselves that avoidance is the same as escape. 25 years later, justice had finally been served, and Catherine's legacy of love would protect children for generations to come.